Welcome to the Last American Vagabond. Joining me today is independent researcher and journalist Freddie Ponton, here to discuss his perception, his take on the ongoing back and forth between Israel and Iran, the bombing of the consulate, the response by Iran, and the impending actions that we're discussing right now in regard to what Israel may do, the U.S. involvement in all of that. It's a really important and nuanced conversation. Robert Inlakesh has been doing excellent work kind of breaking this down. Freddie's got some interesting insights into what happened, what might be going on, and kind of in between it all. So thanks for joining today, Freddie. How are you? It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Ryan. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Yeah, I mean, my pleasure, man. Your insight is always, you always have an interesting insight into a lot of these different dynamics because of the different sources you have and the different research you do. So I'm always excited to talk to you about, what you're seeing in this. So let's start with, I mean, you can start wherever you want. I think that you can go back a long way in this conversation, right? And this is kind of one of the arguments that Israel keeps trying to make, which is that, Iran started this, which quite frankly, I don't think is even remotely true, but you could go back far and like a tit for tat kind of show that there's been back and forth. In my opinion, I think it's very clear that Iran has shown a lot of restraint, but feel free to start wherever you want in that dynamic. And let's talk about where this all comes from. What's going on with Iran and Israel right now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Ryan. I think the best for me to start with will be simply to challenge some concepts as far as the right of Iran to retaliate against the Israeli following the 1st of April strike on their diplomatic complex in Damascus in Syria. Now, I've heard a lot of stories, and it's important to get it right. I think the Iranian diplomatic complex is perhaps considered as Iranian sovereign soil for many, but if you really look into the legal scriptures, you're going to realize very quickly that the Article 2 of the 1961 Vienna Conventions, which basically break down the diplomatic relationship between states and their diplomatic apparatus, then you would realize that it's a little bit vague. It's not quite a clear cut. Of course, a diplomat, an embassy, a consulate, and any building attached to this particular complex, it's under the protections of diplomatic immunity. So there's no doubt about it. So violating that, entering or destroying this building is completely illegal in front of international law. Does it mean that basically the Iranian complex is on sovereign soil? It's not clear. It's not in the text of law. But what's very important, it's in the Vienna 1961 Convention, is Article 2, talks about the establishment of diplomatic relations, Ryan, between states, and a permanent diplomatic mission takes place by mutual consent. And this idea of mutual consent and agreements means that Iran and Syria have an understanding of what this particular building or place represents. And they might have even agreement that we are not preview to, we're not aware of it. So for people to go out there and saying that maybe they are the right, maybe it's sovereign soil, or that we just don't know. There are common norms and guidelines outlined by the conventions, but nothing is, absolutely carved in stone as far as the mutual agreements between Syria and Iran. All I can tell you is that Iran indeed had the right to retaliate, and that is the most important. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. Now,
well, really quickly on that original point, I think that's really an important point through all of this. And so what's interesting, I think the what you're highlighting there is that it may not be like taken to a court of law or in front of the international, court of justice, like that it may end up arguing that that's not technically the legality based on the term. But I think the point that's made in a general sense, even going back before the Vienna Convention, is that these norms, as you highlight, have been established long before that and are honored and have been for a long time by pretty much every party involved. And so that's why it's just a static reality, whether or not that was, again, even before the Vienna Convention, that these were considered their territory, right? And so I think that whether or not it comes to pass where that's the legal definition, that's what most governments have perceived it as, and that's what's more important in the eyes of the Iranian people and the actions of Israel, right? So that was meant to be seen as striking Iran, whether it was actually the case. So it was a very strategic move, right? It was very clear what they were trying to do. I think that's very important from Israel's side.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is, it's quite sacred, when you evolve or your activities are in diplomatic circle, you take this extremely seriously. An attack on a consulate is not a anecdotic, it's something really you want to take seriously, because it is definitely an attack on the Syrian sovereignty anyway. And on that basis, of course, you can extend it to some degree to the Iranians. But I think this is also the accumulations of many strikes against Syrian Iranian object, Iranian protected individuals, which have diplomatic status. And it's just been an ongoing basically strike against object and protected people. So I think from that point of view, at some stage, Iran had to retaliate and say, look, this, you're not going to get away with more crimes. I think we saw 6 months of crime in Gaza. We've told you to stop what you're doing. You don't do it. You go and attack randomly, in other countries, in Lebanon, in Syria. I mean, where's the end? And I think that what Iran was doing is at that moment in time, it was affecting the domestic relationship, the domestic politics. And I think the people of Iran wanted a response. Say, we're not going to be disrespected any longer by Israel. So I think good on them. They did that. I think they did that in a very cautious manner. This was definitely not a strike against the Israeli people or civilians, compared to Gaza. I mean, this is really a lot of cautions. This is what basically people understand by cautions, minimizing the casualties, making sure that the targets are legitimate. In this particular case, we can clearly see that the Iranians have chosen some very key military and military intelligence assets, including airbase, Indonesia desert, with the Raman airbase, and the other airbase as well, the Nevatim airbase as well. And then we saw also strikes on the Golan Heights as well. This is where a lot of intelligence gathering is conducted by the Israelis. It's a little bit the ears of Israel. This is how it is likely they got the informations about all these generals and their team being all at once at this particular building in the diplomatic complex in Damascus. And very quickly they assembled basically jets from one of these two air bases and then strike the consulate buildings. So that was very clear what Iran was doing. What we also know is that they gave a 48 hours notice to the United States, to the Iraqi government, to Jordan, to also countries around. Turkey was very much aware, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. Everybody knew what Iran was doing. And they knew they were not attacking civilians. And they knew that this was a retaliation against military assets. So no surprise. It was not a surprise attack. Right. And I think it's very interesting. And that's what I want to talk about today, is to understand exactly what happened. Because I can read a lot of things until yesterday. It's starting to get a little bit clearer today with some of the statements that were made and some articles that are starting to pop up on social media and on internet. But it's very important to understand that Israel claimed to have stopped 99% of the drones and missiles, including ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, and have basically stopped 99% of these ammunitions is a little bit far from the truth and a stretch from the truth, at least.
Yeah, this is where it gets real. And I'm glad you want to highlight this in general, because, this is what Robert's been covering a lot of this as well. And what we've heard, and it's obviously back and forth. And as you know well, in any situation like this, you almost never can take either side at face value. It's always nothing happened or everything happened, and it's usually somewhere in the middle. But what's interesting is we're hearing from one side of this, which maybe you can shed some light for us, that this was a, strategic planned attack that they wanted them to be aware of, so they could formulate a defense, so they could almost guarantee that there wouldn't be civilian casualties, that they would intentionally like clumsily and lazily, old munitions, like throw at them to make sure that they block them in order to establish very strategic attacks in other places. So what's and then of course, Israel saying 99% stop. So that's not even true. So in your assessment, what's the truth of those numbers? Is it 99% and that was the plan? And so they got specific targets hit, or is it more than that? Was it, how do you see the strikes playing out from the reality of the situation?
Well, the reality, if you will, if you look at the ammunition itself that was stopped from hitting targets in Israel, we're talking more about 97.8 instead of 99%. But this is missing the point.
Mm-hmm.
The real point is not about whether they were stopped or not. The point is who actually stopped and defended Israel. And this is where really it matters. Because really, when you look at the data and the intelligence data, you start to realize that Israel had very little to do with defending its territorial, which means that the Iron Dome and all the other missile defense system never got saturated. Right? So that's the first truth. Right. It was never saturated. And the reason why is because the United States, the UK, and France, to some degree, intervene in this battle space. And in terms of strategy, when you talk about air defense strategy, ideally what you want to do is to obviously protect your country way ahead before these particular munitions are, entering your airspace. And that is the reason why the United States and the UK was authorized to operate in the Iraqi airspace. So 48 hours before the show started, the American decided to dispatch a complete refueling anchors operation in the Iraqi air sky, which meant that this airspace was filled with the possibility for jet fighters to sustain a 6-7 hours ongoing fight without returning to base, whatever the base might be, because there's so many bases they can use, whether the UK, Cyprus, they can use different bases within the region. So there's no problem of getting jet fighters in the airs. The problem when you articulating an air defense strategy, you need to stay in the air as long as possible, and then so that you have a coherent strategy and develop basically your defense before anything could enter Israel. And that's exactly what we saw on Saturday night. It was really basically jet fighters circling, creating what we know as air fences, air portals, if you will. They work in pairs, and these are jet fighters that basically fly pretty high, and they have a view of what's entering Iraq in order to get to Israel, because that's what basically is in between and Israel is Iraq. So this airspace was completely under the control of the United States, to some degree to UK. UK was more involved in the Syrian side of the conflict, so they provided also a lot of air defense in the Syrian airspace, but the whole real bulk of the protection was on the in the Iraqi airspace. And it's very interesting the way they do it, because when we look at the flight radar data, we can clearly see that they have these refueling anchors, which is really part of the intra-theaters, where the jet fighters can come and at all times circulate and go back basically to scouting for more ammunitions. So we saw what the Iranians actually sent towards Israel. We know that there was a lot of drones. I can go down quickly into the numbers. They sent about 170 drones from Iran. They says most of them were intercepted. They got 30 cruise missiles. We know that 25 of them were intercepted. And then we got 120 ballistic missiles from Iran that were fired at Israel. 103 were intercepted. And then 70 drones were fired from the Houthis in Yemen and were intercepted by the US Navy, according to the latest report. We saw basically the US Navy claiming they've shot down at least 3 ballistic missiles near Erbil, Kurdistan, Iraq. They used the Aegis missile defense system aboard 2 guided missile destroyers located in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then the final data that perhaps is interesting is to know that some of the damage that was basically taken by Israel was C-130 airplanes stationed on the Israeli air base, and they also damaged the runway to some degree. But yet again, Israel is doing what they always do, which is to hide all the damage, everything that affects their reputations, their credibility will be hidden. So we did see a couple of footage of the damage created by ballistic missiles, and we're seeing that even walls and infrastructures have no heat signatures, no burning signatures. It's like almost this was fireworks or firecrackers, you know. When you have a ballistic missile falling on your infrastructure, it leaves some serious damage. Right. So again, we've been lied to here by Israel, but we understand why. It's simply because this overwhelming display of capabilities and military capabilities from Iran was, I think, really damning. Mm-hmm. And the point that I'm making today, as you probably understood already, is that without the United States, without the UK, and without France basically providing the air cover above Jordania, because Jordan also was covered by the French with the F5 base. BAP F5 base is operating since 2014 by the French and the Jordanians. They got about 6 Rafales there. 4 Rafales there, and they got about 6 Mirage 2000s there. Now the Rafale was obviously deployed to operate at what is known as the triple border in between basically Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. So they were again deployed there, 2 on the ground, 2 in the air, and they rotate. And again, they were using Mika missile, which is what the Rafale is equipped with, and they were basically just shooting at drones and cruise missile. Important note, Ryan, and then of course I'll give that back to you. It's important to understand that all these airplanes do not target ballistic missiles. They do not, because this is not something they can do. Ballistic missiles were taken by whether naval assets from the US or simply by missile air system defense, which we can talk about it in a moment.
Yeah, this is a really important couple of different important points for the average person to understand that you're highlighting, which is that despite the pushed narratives and the bluster that you get from the US and Israel to act like this was some sort of a success, even though it was broadcasted for even a week in some senses, to feel like this is coming, what we're going to be doing, the amount of drones, and even on the day, they're like hours that will be here. Like they were publicly telling you this, you know, and the idea that this was done intentionally by Iran, at least as they're saying, to make sure that it was, you know, a display. Right. And that they would be prepared. And even some cases arguing that it was more of a distraction so they could end up getting very specific newer missiles to hit specific targets. And I want to ask you, in your opinion, you know, what those specific targets were that they did in fact hit. But that's really important to understand that without the support of the Western nations, that Israel clearly would not have been able to defend this. And even then, they still hit the targets they were going for. That's a really powerful message that's sent to clearly Israel and the US have both, I'm sure, taken, but also the idea of how important Iraq is to all of this dynamic, which, by the way, is why the U.S. refuses to leave, despite their parliament voting more than once that they have to. But they go, we respect your sovereignty, but we ignore that entirely, and we're going to stay here. You know, it's a ridiculous joke. It's important strategically. The land bridges, I mean, all the occupation, that's so obvious to me, that example of why it's important. You could even go as far as to say it's just to protect Israel. And that wouldn't surprise me at all. And
yeah.
Go ahead. You have a comment?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really the cards are on the table. I mean, you know, there's no more hiding. You know, at this stage, clearly the American and the UKs are allowed to operate in Iraqi airspace. The French are allowed to operate freely in terms of the Jordanian airspace. Now they're all going to claim they are defending their base, and this is the current tactic. You know, to say, well, you know, you're sending drones in an airspace that is not authorized, not open for you. We believe you're shooting our airbase, so we're going to defend and we're going to basically deploy our Rafale jet fighters. But all in all, what it's saying is Jordan and Iraq has basically been vital in terms of helping Israel. Now, Jordanians have been, attacking to some degree Israel for the onslaught of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, but I still don't understand, with such a large Palestinian population living in Jordan, and I have friends in Jordan. I mean, they live in the United States, but they're Palestinians of origins, but they grew up in Amman, in Jordan. And for them, it's just like they don't understand the positions of their leader. And King Abdullah is taking a lot of risk by doing what he's doing. The Iraqi government, as you said, has got a clear positions in 2023. You know, around November, December, starting to negotiate the exits of foreign forces on Iraqi soils. But this airspace is a major problem, because without this control of the airspace, you have no control of Syria, you have no control of Iraq, you have no control, therefore, of the protections of Israeli backyard. And that's a major defense, basically a question mark, if you will, because in the future, if there was no access for the American or the Brits or the French in that particular region, in this airspace, Israel will be extremely overwhelmed very quickly, and there's clearly nothing they can do, because you see, you can take maybe 1, 2, 3 when we got 130 ballistic missiles. Now, I don't believe, to be honest, all the statements that I've made, because they're all coming from the United States and from Israel. Now, if you're telling me that with the system that they have in place, that involves the US system defense, the radar system, the RIM 161, all these kind of IBM, that they can really, you know, deployed, that cost fortunes. I mean, these things costing between $9 to $30 million a pop, you know. So going after ballistic missile is an expensive business, and you need really a special weaponry to do that. So we know that perhaps the best tools that Israeli have is the Arrow 3. Arrow 3 was, I think, put in operation in 2017. This is a very efficient tool to go after the ballistic missile, because it goes exo-atmospheric, which means it goes above the layer of atmosphere. And this is the time where this particular missile is the most vulnerable. It's just before it starts its descent, where it picks up a lot of speed. And some of them are equipped with MARV technology. Ryan, MARV technology is simply basically a maneuverability vehicle that is attached basically to the warheads that allow basically the missile operator to take control during the descent of the warheads. So it gives you maneuverability, but also the possibility to correct the trajectory as well. So it's extremely precise. And funny enough, it's not even the best at what the Iranians sent at Israel. So it's just too expensive for Israel. This war, if it was to be sustained over a period of a week, 2 weeks, we're talking about billions, hundreds of billions of dollars that will be required to just avoid and protect, you know, main city like Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. So this is not sustainable at all.
And that's a very important point to all of this. And first of all, I believe the Arrow 3, that was at least funded and studied and worked on in Alaska to some degree, correct? In the United States, I believe that was at least tested there more than once, if I remember correctly, but I could be wrong off the top of my head.
It's developed by the Indians with the Israeli and the American. From what I know, it might have been tested in the Arctic. I'm not too sure about that, but I know it's an Indian Israeli project.
I could be wrong about the which missile, but I know that the Israelis are with the United States government have tested multiple missiles in Alaska. I believe it was that one, but just on a side note. But yeah, what's important is the cost conversation that you brought up. That's very important, and I'm glad you brought this up. I want your thoughts on this, what your research has shown, because as I understand it, earlier estimates were, you know, somewhere over 500 something million. Now we're at the point where later, as more is developed, people are arguing over 1.5 billion has been spent in the response. And you tell me if that's accurate, and then what your research has shown, because I've heard the same thing in the reverse, that apparently Iran's response was pretty minimal. Like there was very specific, and this is where we get into the claim that even if 99% was accurate, that seems to have at least been to some degree by design, that a lot of these lazy munitions and older munitions were used in the drones, which arguably were done to sort of distract, while they then sent specific targeted newer munitions that might have been more expensive that hit specific targets. So in your assessment, what's the accuracy of those numbers in regard to what the US spent to defend, or, you know, all of it combined, and then what Iran spent to carry it out? Do you know, what's your insight there?
Where you get basically to split this cost in two. So because it falls into two different categories. One is purely defense, missile defense cost, which means the cost of basically operating missile systems, the human resources, and of course the ammunition itself. So very quickly, this is why the price goes high to 1.4, 1.5 million dollars. That's just the defense. But as I said, and I explained earlier, most of the defense did not occur above or within the Israeli airspace. Most of this defense, and which turned into attack, because when you have, as I say, a refueling anchors, it allows you really to have your jet fighters in the air all along. And what they do is they attack the drones, they attack the cruise missiles. Now, if you look at the equipment that is used for that, for example, the United States use a AIM-9, for example, the side. I don't know, I can't remember the name of it, but if you give me 2 seconds, I'll give you the name of it. It's called AIM-9 Sidewinder. That's what basically the US is using. And they also use AIM-120 AMRAAM. So these are infrared and electromagnetic missiles that can target drones and cruise missiles. They're extremely expensive. So we're talking now about a defense expenditure, because America and all the assets in the air are spending basically and emptying their missiles. And when you have hundreds of drones, when you get hundreds of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, then you can only imagine how much you need to hit. And it's not always a win. Sometimes it misses, so you got to go back into it. And we know from open source data that these guys, they function as a pair. So as I said, they can go out there, go after these drones. They can get maybe 5, 6 at a time. So you get a pair, you get 12 basically drones, take it out in one strike, and you got to do that again for 6 hours. I can tell you the price there is at least 1.5 billion. All in all, you're talking about 3.5 billions in cost for this particular operation. That's why it's not sustainable. Israel cannot afford that, not in a million years.
Yeah, or any of them. Like it's not. It's specifically. I think it's obvious that one individual nation would. Even all of them combined. The point is not even whether, like, I would argue that they could find a way by squeezing their people even more to just continue to produce and find more money somewhere. The point is that it's unsustainable. Your point you're highlighting, that they're going to spend so much money to stop what arguably is a much, not even arguably, is a much cheaper munition, whether drones or otherwise. So do you know what Iran arguably spent in their offensive? Because I understand that it's dramatically less, right?
Yes, it's dramatic, because the drones are manufactured in Iran, which means that you're talking about in between $20,000 to the most sophisticated drones to $30,000. But that's the ballpark here you're dealing with. So
you're talking millions compared to billions, right?
Exactly.
Wow,
so
that's crazy.
That's the economics that's starting to really doesn't make sense, because you're spending millions against a country that is spending billion when a country is spending millions. Perhaps the whole show cost, if it costs 500 million, I'd be surprised, because it's all homemade. It's all homemade in Iran. There's no import there. And we know the technology that is used by the Iranians. There's no doubt about it. So if you look at the price of the IMAD, the liquid-fueled MRAV exoatmospheric cluster submunition decoy, we're not in the billions. We're not in a million per missile. And same for the Kebar Sheikhan as well, the solid-fueled ultra-maneuverable light warhead. It's got an MRV as well on the final stage, but these are old technology. It's been out there for quite some times now. And same for the Quarter as well, for the liquid fueled heavy warhead missile that doesn't have MRV. So you're not talking about some highly sophisticated technology. You're talking about something that has been manufactured, that is out there for a long time. It is in the stockpile of the Iranian militaries. So they got rid of it. And more importantly, the real takeaway for the Iranians, because I think it's important to say that in line with the economy, it's the ability to gather intelligence. Because now, clearly Iran knew where the Israeli assets were in Israel, those that wanted to strike, and probably other intelligence assets from the Israeli armed forces. But the amount of gathering of intelligence that they've able to accumulate during this strike is, you cannot put a price to that. It will cost billions to get that kind of information, because now you get all these systems, all these missile systems, the American systems out there deploying, showing their capabilities, and all that Iran has to do now is to tweak it and know what works, what doesn't work. And we can clearly see the waves of drone, the wave of cruise missile, and eventually the ballistic missile. All was that really was timed properly in terms of making sure this wave arrived at the same time to saturate the Iron Dome and all the missile defense systems. It didn't happen because most of them were stopped above the sky of Iraq. Can you imagine if the Americans were not there? It would have been a disaster. I don't think there will be any airbase left.
Right. Well, so on that very note, then, what has your research shown that they did in fact hit with these carefully used, specifically targeted newer munitions underneath the distraction of all the rest of it? Do you know, have you confirmed what they have in fact hit? Can you confirm for that first for the show?
All I can tell you is from reliable sources, they went for the Navy team and the Ratom Air Base, because this is where they have the flights and the airplanes that actually participated in the strikes against Damascus in the Ratom Base mainly. So they went for that. But as I said, only the report you're getting now, you're not getting Iranian report as far as the damage, and we cannot rely on Israeli report as far as the damage. All we got is a couple of, shitty videos showing us a couple of holes in the ground with, I call it the shovel missiles. He goes under the infrastructures, but nothing get burns. The plastic pipe are still there. I think a couple of investigators and journalists are also picked up on that. So it's absolutely right. It's just, complete, propaganda, because the shame of being it, despite all this help, some of the missiles were able to go through, and that's all matters. That's all people need to know. It's the vulnerability of Israel that has been basically unveiled, if you will. And that's basically the myth of Israel being a fortress has been shattered. And that's really, really difficult to take. Now it's obviously the time for reflection for the Israeli militaries, whether they feel that this is appropriate for them to retaliate directly into Iran, which I doubt they will do, not only because the United States is probably not going to provide any further support or air support on the basis that the latest statement from the Iranian government is clear that as soon as missiles or any kind of things, any kind of attack leave the Israeli soil, they will launch their attack.
And I believe they said 10 times the response, right? That was the
what they're going to do is going to be better, because now they have the data, so they know where to go, where not to go. And more importantly, the masterpiece is that if they're going to do it right away, no one is going to have the time to go in the air and starting to put up together a strategy for air defense over the Iraqi sky. It takes time. It's not something you just plug in 2 minutes and everybody's operational. You got to have, of course, protocols and process in place, but people needs to know what they're doing, because you're still fighting above a country that is not yours. You got to provide some guarantees as well. It's very tricky. Israel has got himself in a bit of a pickle, right?
Yeah, and I would point out that would be a real example of what self-defense actually would look like, right? Because even the game is being played now. Like I wouldn't even call Iran's response. It was a legal retaliation. But this game we play about what self-defense means, it's not self-defense when you're responding in a calculated way after the fact. That you can call it legal, but it's just this game of those terms. It frustrates me, So if you're actually in the midst of being attacked, deciding to start fighting back and responding, that would be a real. I would argue that that's maybe one more reason why they said that, because no one's going to try to. There's no way you could argue it's not self-defense if you're literally firing back on top of what they're doing. I find that interesting, and I wanted to point out the idea of them only targeting, or rather, this is Israel will claim that if they wouldn't have stopped everything, they would have murdered everybody. I'm sure that's the claim that's coming around. But as you now see, they warned and all the stuff we talked about, it seems clear that they wanted it to get stopped and they targeted those specific areas. And it turns out that they hit the ones that were specifically related to the consulate strike. So from a legal perspective, if you take this to court, it's really difficult not to see the response being a legal response, despite all of the screaming, right? I think that's really important. And this, go ahead.
Yeah. what
Good.
matters here, Ryan, is the proportionality in terms
Right.
of international law. Is that how proportionate? Now, if the same attack had killed thousands of civilians on the ground, that would have been a problem, because then suddenly they have a lever, to direct basically the case towards, you kill civilian. This is not proportionate. Therefore, this is not according to international law. Iranians were very careful about what they were doing. Their plan was really well calculated. And even the Hezbollah, because obviously the Hezbollah actually started to fire before the Iranians on the Golan Heights. So they knew what they were going after there. And when the second wave arrived, I think the Hezbollah started to strike again the Golan Heights. So we can clearly see that there are attacks come from 3 different fronts. You got Iran, you got Lebanon, and then you get the Houthis out there still sending drones or sending, missiles, at Israel. So when these 3 countries, and this, what is known as the acts of resistance, is working in a lockstep, they're extremely dangerous, and Israel is very, very vulnerable. You cannot count all the time on the United States to save the day. So the US is doing what we've seen so far, which is say, okay, our loyalty to Israel is ironclad. But what does that really mean? Ironclad until we have problem, because we have another war on the Ukrainian front with the Russians, and we need to sponsor that war as well. There's a time where domestically, from a political point of view, there's going to be, the US politics is going to have to pay a price for that. And I think already, ultimately, the Congress already has expressed some doubt about, getting further involved in a regional conflict. Why? Because they will end up with 3 theaters. Because if you get involved in an open conflict with Iran, you're going to get involved with Russia and China, period. Right. And if that is something that the United States, according to the current stance of the US Army and their capabilities, maritime assets and so on, and the financials, they just simply cannot face that kind of threat. So that's the reason why the United States wants to de-escalate, because financially it will be a disaster, and I think technically they'll probably get a beating for the whole world to see. So they're going to put their foot down now with Israel and telling them to cool down. And if Israel or Netanyahu, because Netanyahu is not Israel, Netanyahu is a lunatic that is looking after himself with more lunatics. He surrounded himself with more crazy people that are messianic in the way, in the school of thought, if you will. So they're looking at it as a way to bring about, the whatever arrival of the Messiah, or I don't know, whatever they believe in it anymore, but and the reconstructions of the Third Temple. This is all part of the Messianic that comes out of Israel, and this
Greater Israel,
really dangerous, because the ultimate ending is catastrophe. And then on the other side, you get the same Messianic vision coming out of the evangelist, which basically wants to bring the redemption to the earth by bringing the Armageddon. So you got really a bunch of kind of interesting characters on both sides of the fence that are basically come together, looking for changing the world as we know it, on the strength of the blood of the Palestinian people. It's hard to swallow at this stage. When I've been looking at it for 6 months, I pull myself a little bit away, because it's really hard at some stage. But what I can really say, and my ultimate analysis of all this, is that clearly the United Nations needs to go. This body is completely obsolete. It has let us down with the WHO during the COVID-19, and clearly has let us down the Palestinian for way too long. Israel has been given a free pass. All the resolutions have indicated that Israel is in a breach of international law, and currently in the court for possibly, being in contravention of the Genocide Convention. So this is pretty a bad resume for countries, and I don't think Israel will ever recover from that. I think they'll become extremely isolated.
I agree. And I think the point with the United States is, like, I like that you highlighted that. It's not, their history shows very clearly that they don't care about the things they project to the world, the altruism that they fake all the time. It's not that they care that this is war killing civilians. It's that, oh, well, we can't manage that many wars simultaneously, so we'll take advantage of playing the one trying to care about civilians, at least the people in the rulership positions. That's what I would argue, right? It's not that, like, what I mean is you're going to start to see these pushes from people in political positions in the US because they know they can't manage multiple wars at the same time at this point, that they're going to argue that we need to pull back on this for humanitarian reasons, and people will buy it. That's always how that goes, in my opinion. And I would actually, we should talk more in the future about the overlap, the Masonic issues there. It's really interesting to see how they project these ideas about like Iran and other places that do have a theocratic overlap, that even as they like sprint in the direction of animal sacrifice and prophecies and all this, it's just interesting to see the difference where, you're accusing them of being a problem while you're doing similar things. I think that's interesting. But
yeah, it's a very simple things. The messianic side of the Western world is purely based in LGBTQ ideology and wokeism ideology and nihilism. This is what it is. It's nothing else. So when you put that together and you're trying to look at a way forward that is hopeful, you're starting to see that there's not much hope there, because they're leading you to Armageddon. They're leading you to catastrophe, because that's what the evangelist messianist and this new kind of technocrat movement and liberal movement is trying to promote out there, with the promise of making the world a better place. They're not making the world a better place, and never succeeded in doing this, simply because they cannot do that at home. If you cannot live by your own recommendations, and show the example, then clearly you cannot go out there around the world and dictate, at will. And I think you have to look at a very important message, despite, apart from the strike from the Iranian over the weekend. This is the second time the United States hegemon has been challenged, because you have Russia on one side that was the first one to put pretty much, draw the line in the sand and say, look, we're done with you guys, whether it's going to be NATO, US force, it's all the same thing. We're not going to obey to what you're telling us to do. We're not living by your book or by your stories or by your conditions. We have our own way of looking at things. There's things we want to do in our own ways, and you're not going to dictate us. And now you have Iran doing exactly the same thing, because remember, the United States told Iran to not attack, and that there will be reprisal and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, Iran did it. So it's the second time in 2 years that we have two major candidates that is going out there and say, no more American hegemony. I think the message couldn't be stronger.
I agree. And I think it's being picked up by a lot of people around the world. And I honestly think it's something that has been prominent for a lot longer than people realize. It's now just become somehow politically acceptable in mainstream circles. And I think that's always a big shifting point. But let's get into the idea of the response, right? Because it's actually pretty interesting to see how this has developed. So immediately we saw the usual suspects. I believe it was either Ben-Gvir or Smotrich, or one of the more extreme levels of the religious Zionism party, that came out immediately and said, I promise an unprecedented response, was the quote, which I don't know how that could mean anything but nuclear weapons in the context of what's been used already, right? And then said to the Israeli population, don't go to bed tonight. You don't want to miss basically what we're going to do, but nothing happened. So it's interesting. So then it clearly got walked back, right? So we see the U.S. ironclad, everyone coming out, the usual suspects, the Lindsey Grahams of the world, screaming for attacks on Iran immediately, like crazy lunatics. But then all of a sudden we see Biden and their administration come out and sort of say, well, they succeeded with stopping it. So it's sort of like a tit for tat that was accomplished. And Netanyahu seemed to have walked it back. And now your tweet, we're seeing in this, I believe it was yesterday, saying Israel wants to carry out an attack, but with coordination with the United States. So tell us where this is at. Are you expecting an Israeli response? Are they playing the whole card where, outside of their usual belligerent response, they're like taking a card out of Iran's book and saying, we're going to respond when it's our time and we think it's necessary, which is wildly uncharacteristic for Israel? Where do you see this going?
Well, basically, as you said, the general chief of staff of the Israeli army, General Halevi, came very quickly and made it very clear that Israel is going to respond.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter what the US is saying. And I think people really need to realize that these people don't really care too much about what the United States is going to say, because there's an ego here. There is saving face kind of a symptom, if you will, that they have to prove to their people that they're in control. Because if they cannot prove this, then politically speaking, I think Netanyahu and this coalition is going to be in a dire positions, in the weeks to come, especially when they still haven't provided any kind of a victory on the ground. I mean, people are still looking at victory really in the Gaza Strip. All they saw is civilians being murdered, but we haven't seen really Hamas being diminished. We haven't seen the recovery of hostages, and now they are basically claiming that most of the battalions left of Hamas are in Rafah, and they need to move 1.4 million people. That seems just pretty much beyond their reach, and no preparation yet has been on the way in order to accommodate such displacements of population. So people are really starting to doubt. We know that Gallant's, from political point of view, has already asked Netanyahu to go for election in September, early elections, because they want to move away from Netanyahu. They believe that Netanyahu no longer is serving the purpose, and I think they will do a better job. And I think that's what we're going to be looking at. Is we're going to look at Israeli implosion from a political point of view. So that's the first part. And then, of course...
And really quickly, using Netanyahu's removal as if that solves the problem, which it doesn't. Go ahead.
It absolutely doesn't, because the problem is that you're dealing with an ideology that has taken over Israel, whether it's in the public or in the politics. People have no problem having at the doorstep 37,000 civilians being killed and murdered, and so many more under the rubble. So when you arrive at this level of kind of ability of sociopathy and being able to function as a state, in a world community with this kind of data and resume, you really have a major problem. And this problem at some stage is going to manifest. And it's going to first manifest politically, and then very quickly it will also manifest on the street of Israel. So we are, up for some serious show in Israel within the months to come. I believe a lot of things will happen. And this strike, I think Israel is very aware that Iran is not going to wait, it's not going to provide any warning this time. And you have Hossein Amir Abdollahian, the Iranian foreign minister, coming today on national televisions in an interview and basically saying that we're not going to wait this time. Anything that leaves the Israeli soil, any threat against us, we launch an attack that is going to be so much bigger of what we've done over the weekend. And this time, maybe it is possible that the US might not intervene. This will be a disaster. Right. So, yeah, the situation is quite critical for the Israeli government. And I think the reality is starting to sink in. And if they're going to attack any assets, I think they'll go after the Hezbollah, perhaps in Lebanon, maybe throwing a couple of things at Syria. That's what I would expect from the Israeli governments to get engaged with. But as far as attacking Iran directly, this would be pure suicide.
I agree. I don't think that's, I know that there are some levels of the Israeli government that want that and are pushing for that, as well as the US government, whether bluster or not. But I agree with you. And I think it's going to, if it happens, it'll end up being, which I think it will, a response that's claimed to be targeted at Iran, but be groups that are in fact not Iran, despite being aligned with Iran, right? Like a Hezbollah, Ansarallah, like that, which it's meant to give the impression that that's what happened. So I want your thoughts on a couple of things. I think this is interesting. This is posted by...
give me 2 seconds, Ryan. I'm just plugging myself on. My computer is running out of batteries.
Go for it. Go for it.
About that technical thing. Sorry.
No, go for it. I'll go over this. So basically, this is an article that's been published by, or a post on Twitter from Myrav Zonsi. I forgot. I terribly hack her name every time. Zonsi. And she's a senior Israeli analyst and writes for a lot of different corporate media articles, New York Times or platforms, Washington Post. But 972 magazine is the primary, I believe. Let me know if you're on track. Okay, so you're back. So basically, this is a article she published, and it says, An isolated Netanyahu facing widespread criticism a week ago now has the backing of the West and deflected global attention from the Gaza. I mean, of course, here's the picture of him acting like this was unprecedented, ignoring the consulate attack, which I'll include links for, by the way, if you want to recognize that. But Freddie already did a good job pointing that out. But here is what I wrote. Just like using a military engagement with Gaza to boost his numbers, Netanyahu has clearly benefited from drawing out this response from Iran, at least in the immediate sense. Netanyahu has created conflict to better his standing. Creating conflict to better his standing is something Israeli media has reported on many times over the years. So I think it's first and foremost important to understand that this could have been a desperate act, and it seems like it was, to draw the support from the allies that were increasingly calling for them to act differently in Gaza now are hardcore on the side of ironclad support for Israel. A lot of people have stopped looking at Gaza. They're focusing on this conversation. So that's one part of this that I think is very clear. Here's the other part that I think is very interesting. This is Sharmin Narwani, and this is from the Cradle, and it says, quote, an Iranian military security official has revealed that the U.S. contacted the Islamic Republic, which, again, that could be a lie, but consider this. I think it's interesting, asking the nation to allow Israel a symbolic strike to save face following Iran's retaliatory drone and missile barrage this weekend. It's so interesting, all the stuff that we don't see behind everything, right? So what do you take all that as? Give me your thoughts on that. I find that really interesting.
I think the Cradle article is very true.
No, I agree. I just always being
what
objective.
I'm getting as well. That's what I'm getting as well. And I can tell you, I'm very convinced that this makes sense to me. This makes sense that the US would want to use the back channel. Look, all this operation, what we are saying, we probably gather 70, 80% eventually later on of what happened. There's still a 20, 30% of unknown that is just only circulating in diplomatic circles. So you're never going to know. These are privileged channels. Right. And sometimes they're not even diplomatics. There's just this personal relationships that falls into the equations in order to get some influence with the leaders and telling them, look, we thought that everybody could be happy if we can, accommodate Israel with a looking good exercise, so that everybody's happy and we can all go back to our genocide. But at the end of the day, it's a bit naive. That's what I found about this. It's very naive to think that Iran function that way. Iran is extremely serious about what has been done to the Palestinian people, and they want to hold Israel accountable and the United States accountable, because there's no such a thing of just Israel. And when you see Baerbock, from Germany, foreign ministers coming to, to see, we're going to always be there for Israel. What can we do for you? What can you do is to tell them to stop the genocide around the corner of the people that they're responsible for. And you can also tell them, by the meantime, that, to stop carrying on what they're doing, because this is going to end up pretty badly for Israel. So the guilty trip of the German foreign ministers is just a shame. This woman has no shame. So what is this relationship? What is Baerbock's relationship with Israel? We know she's super tight with Blinken. That's what we know. Is she doing favor, or is she doing a favor for Blinken? Perhaps. What is really the key of some of these key politicians in the German government that seems to be really on the knees in front of Israel? So what's the secret there? I think we all know that money buys people, money buys allegiance. And I think that we clearly see that, and you guys experience that in the United States, with so many politicians taking Israeli money with the AIPAC. And that's a shame, because, it's not good for the Jewish people that have absolutely no interest in these Zionist states there that is clearly depicted as an apartheid state, and I lived in South Africa, that my wife is South African. So I sit down with second half of my family that I went through apartheid, and I can tell you from a personal experience that you hear some gruesome stories, Now, you have to learn forgiveness. That is the ultimate lesson that you must learn, But at the end of the day, we're in the 21st century, and we thought this lesson had been learned, and yet we're still dealing with countries that are happy to function under this ruling. So, as I said, I think at this moment in time, something needs to happen within Israel. I don't think the solution can come from the United States or from the Western world. The Western world has done as much as they could to support Israel based on their allegiance and loyalty and everything that goes with it. But we arrive pretty much, in a bottleneck there, and the options are extremely limited now for the West. So Israel needs to come to their senses, or they're going to get a serious beating. That's the reality.
I agree. And on your point about the influence and money, I mean, I 100% agree that the money is, sometimes like Occam's razor, the simplest explanation does tend to be the correct one often, right? Money could just be enough. But I find that hard to believe today. I guarantee it's part of the conversation, but I've never seen in my time doing this my entire life so many politicians, and politicians alone are a position that you're historically used to being like sellouts. I'll say whatever I need to say. I'll shake your hand, even though I hate you, because I want your vote, right? That's how we've always come. Now, all of a sudden, you're seeing U.S. politicians talking to their own constituents in Congress and going, I'll never support you. I'll never fight for the Palestinians. And it's like, I've never seen that before. And I look at Joe Biden, for example. I mean, I think it's like 85% of people, the Democrats, are like, we're not voting for this guy. Who would ever destroy their entire political future to support what everyone seems to recognize as a problem, unless there's something else there? Now, I'm not saying I can prove that, but I'm thinking if we know the overlap of something like an Epstein network that we all know about, but weirdly still kind of some circles regard as conspiracy, even though it's been proven that was, as Acosta pointed out, overlap with Mossad and CIA. I mean, these are real things. So I'm only pointing out that I wonder what else is being done to drive these people to destroy everything they ever built, including the illusion of some rules-based international order. They've destroyed it all, right? Just to support Israel. It's fascinating, but it's also quite alarming to see the kind of crack through the door, the real picture behind everything, You
see, there's a simple explanation to that. We understand the messianic aspects of Israel, this ultra-Orthodox and these ultra-religious visions of the world, and that we understand that. I think everybody has a good pictures of that. What is less understood is the West. What's going on into these people's mind? Why suddenly we can't get any sense out of them? Why they're happy to look at hundreds of thousands of people being killed around the world, and it's okay, it's all right, it's for the it's for the good of the United States, it is for our national security purposes. The reality is has nothing to do, obviously, with the U.S. national security. It has to do with a form of messianism. And if you want to resume it, it's basically by taking God out of the equation. And you replace it with wokeism. You replace it with LGBTQism. You replace him with nihilism. And then you're basically attach these people around this particular doctrines and set of belief. And that's what we've been seeing for the past 15, 20 years, moving really away from anything that is so dear to the American people and to the Western world, which is Christianism, which is the values that has been, ingrained in our societies. My parents are Catholic, for example, and they don't have to go to the church every day or every weekend, but these values that they've carried all their life with them is who they are. And this value, if they're not yet carried by these new generations of politicians and technocrats, that seems for them to be useless, because the future of humankind is for a different path. And the path they offered us is technocracy. And as I say, wokeism and LGBTism and nihilism. So it's really this problem, because now you get two fanatism basically working together on world stage. And with a lot of money, a lot of weapons, a lot of resources, and a lot of influence. That is extremely dangerous, and that's why people, many others out there, are fighting so that we can preserve what we believe in. Whether we are religious or not, it's irrelevant, absolutely irrelevant. But we need to defend this value, these sacred values of families, of natures, and children's and women's are always out of the equations. Even the gangsters knows that.
Right. And I agree. And the final piece to connect it in my mind would be for people to finally realize the truth of Zionism. And that, interestingly enough, it is also outside of the concept of religion, Herzl himself being a founder, being an atheist. The reality is this is a manipulation, guys. Now, that doesn't mean every Zionist is aware of that, but to realize the true dark reality behind it all, and this is not about all Israelis or all Jews, it's a Zionist issue, or really, to your point, is a much bigger problem that overlaps other nations in the same very alarming way. I think technocracy is an easy way for people to understand that, but it's multifaceted in that way. But it is interesting. So we'll leave that there. But that's a whole other conversation that we should have, by the way.
Yeah, we'll get it, because it's an important one to approach, to understand the fake Zionism. There's no left and right Zionism. That doesn't exist. There's always been one Zionism, and then we got, for a period of time, laicity and laicism, incorporated in Zionism, but that didn't last long. But the real essence of Zionism, I think, is very clear to everyone.
Well, that, and I mean, the overlapping prophecy discussions. I mean, we should get into this stuff in another conversation. Today is important that we leave it with the, what's going on with Iran and Israel. And I want to end today with a question that, I mean, I think everything you've said today is absolutely correct. I mean, I think what we're seeing is obvious. I think the evidence can back it up. Your research is very clear, but I always point out that we need to be as objective as possible and just never shy away from any questions. Never, right? Even if if there's not evidence to consider it, we should still go, what's the possibility of that? Even if it's none, consider it, put it away. The question is, there is a lot of people out there that are arguing that everything we're seeing is theater, which, by the way, you get that with every event ever, all the time these days. There's somebody out there saying it's all a false flag. It's all, which maybe it is, it's always possible, right? But in your opinion, is there any credence or any possibility that there's some level of coordination behind all of this? And that this was more so about creating a distraction, or, because people point out, and this is where I see it stemming from, and rightly so, we should be cautious and can question that Iran during the COVID-19 conversation didn't really side on the, stood more so with the Great Reset side of this. And so now it's like people can only see that lens. And so they think all of this is more theater for the larger agenda, So what do you think about just the question about whether some of this might have been theater? In any of your research, is there any indication of that?
There's always, it's not just specifically what we've witnessed over the weekend. There is always in diplomatic circle a show that's going to be put on to satisfy, the public, to give a certain image where everybody gets some kind of, benefit or gain out of that. So it's the message. You take care of the message, whether this is about military escalations. It's just not happen in a vacuum. This is something that is negotiated. You escalate there. Okay, I'm going to do that. I'm not going to do too much. I'm going to do a little bit. And the next time you do that, and this happens all the time. You see it with Hezbollah, you see it with Israel IDF, you see that with Iran, you'll see that with Russia and Ukraine. It's normal. It's part of how things are handled. Now,
like
behind this,
we already talked about it. Just the same point that they're asking for a show behind the scenes, like let's pretend, right? The same kind of point.
Yeah, it really happens. It really happens. This is not something out of the blue or something exotic. It's really something that you can believe in, because it's the way it's conducted. Now, beside that, there is limit to how much show you can put on, because there are real, underground interests, mainly economics, for the Iranians, because they've been under sanction for such a long time. Remember that, when the Shah was brought in, by the United States in Iran, there was this old period where a lot of people, across Iran that went study abroad, that got to do with the West, they impregnated themselves a lot with the Western cultures. Many Iranian friends as well, and Germany, American. These are people that are not fanatics whatsoever. They're very modern people. They embrace modern technology. They embrace a lot of modern things. But those that have basically were left at home got and gained a lot of also knowledge about the West. So they understand the West very well, more than we understand them, that is for sure. And that is, I think, been disregarded. I think that there is, again, a misunderstanding, because it's not a real misunderstanding. It's more that the United States propaganda, the West propaganda, tends to demonize and vilify, same that they do in Russia. It's that these are retarded people. We shouldn't, follow these people. They're a bit backwards. They're not that advanced. Yet we're dealing with some countries that have the most advanced technology, even space program. So they can't be that backward after all. But for political purposes and geopolitical reasons, we've been trying to portray these guys as terrorists, as mullah, as terrible people, almost like they have no heart and they'll kill your son and your kids and your dog. This is really almost ignorant at best. This
sounds like another country we're watching today.
Yeah, exactly. And more importantly, I think it's important to understand the history of Iran. This is such a rich history, such an old history. There's a lot we can, learn from Iran as well. But the dialogue needs to remain real, founded in truth. The problem is lies seems to have taken over, and the West is lying at will. That's all we get. Look at John Kirby on national television. I mean, this guy is a professional liar. He's never inclined to tell you what he actually thinks. He's happy to cover for Biden incompetency and his administration incompetency, and that's okay. The big check is still falling. The money, the support, the political support is still incoming. It doesn't matter because the values are not there anymore. So anything goes. It's open bar.
Yeah, well, that is his job. I mean, that's literally his job description. If you understand what they're there to obfuscate, right? I mean, and I think it's clear that they know that, and so that's why I've over the years stopped really taking the time to try to break some of these down. I let great groups like Decentralized News out there give me the clips they think are But if I watch those State Department briefings, I'm stopping it every 5 seconds, going, "That's a lie. I have to break that down." It just wastes my time because they lie about everything. It's infuriating.
Yeah, it is. And it's very frustrating because obviously I think there's more people in the world that want peace than war.
100%.
There's absolutely no doubt for me that normal people, rational people are, the world is made of people like that, of us in general. There's always exceptions, of course. But in general, I think the masses are pretty interested in getting on with their life, making sure the world is peaceful, that we get on with each other, and that we've somehow been looked after by governments in a way that, benefit us, so that we can improve our education system, we can improve our health system, we can improve our quality of life, and then our understanding of life as well. Really understanding, what is our purpose. And I think this is what we've lost. We've moved so far away from really our true purpose, which is to really go out there and trying to find out how can we better ourselves, how do we fit in this universe, ask ourselves the big questions, and how together we must come together to answer these questions. A lot of resources is available. The problem is most of the money of the world today is being spent at killing people.
Yeah,
we need to change that, and that's what we out there. It doesn't matter whether we're going to make money out of it. It's irrelevant. What matters is that we must keep that fight going on, because this is the humanity, that is at risk today with these lunatics in power.
100%. Well said.
That's why I'm here. That's why I'm here late at night, early in the morning. I don't care. I'm out there because I believe that eventually we will be successful.
I completely agree, man. As well said. And I think it's, it's just important to maintain that. And I think that, I think Caitlin Johnstone said a while ago that, I think that's even where I use that crack in the door analogy, is that she said, that you only really ever get to see that little, crack. And really what that shows you is that if you kick the door open, like, imagine the kind of things they're truly doing back there, and we're the government. But in reverse, you've got the people out there that they clearly pretend to be good, fighting for freedom, fighting for democracy, because they know we want that, right? So take that as a reality, that they're always trying to paint a picture of how everyone's so evil, but the reality seems to be quite clear that most of the population of the world truly want, what any normal person wants: stability, a life, a home, a family, like, just live my life outside of it all, and I think that we are actually starting to break through with some of this to the people that might have been lost in the paradigm and the back and forth and the hype, and so it's really important that people continue to support work like yourself and work that you're doing. So thank you for being here today and breaking this down. I mean, there's so much that we could get into, but I do believe that we're making a difference, Freddie. I do. And I think people are starting to see this stuff. So anything you want to go ahead.
We have the numbers. We have the numbers. We out there. We have the numbers. There was no problem about winning on that side. All we need is to be coherent and working together. That's it.
Yes.
Keep on doing and putting the truth out there. Truth always prevail. That's it.
Well said. Well said. Well, on that note, I'll leave you there, brother, and we'll connect again in the near future. As always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Thank you very much.
Let me preface these remarks with: I never never, ever believe Israeli figures. I've been in the government too long to know that the Israelis are patent liars.